Hey guys, tonight we begin with the unfortunate life of a medieval thief, a job that promised quick coin and exciting night runs, and usually delivered something else. It was dirty, dangerous, and usually over by the time you turned 23, if you were lucky. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you've woken up in medieval Europe, you're broke, you're hungry, and your only marketable skill is owning a functioning pair of legs. Congratulations, you're now a solid candidate for life as a petty thief. But let's be clear, nobody wanted to be a thief. It wasn't a rebellious lifestyle choice. No one in the 14th century leaned on a pitchfork and said, "When I grow up, I want to steal pies and dodge pitchforks." This wasn't Ocean's 11. This was desperation. Volume 3, with extra mud. The economy was not in your favour. Wages were laughable, assuming you were lucky enough to have a job at all. Most peasants lived hand to mouth, except the mouth was cracked and missing teeth, and the hand was probably frostbitten. If the harvest failed, or your lord decided taxes should now include your last chicken and half your dignity, you either begged or started borrowing things that didn't belong to you permanently. Now, you could try honest work. Sure. But here's the problem. Honest work in medieval times usually involved back-breaking labour for 14 hours a day, followed by a supper of barley paste and judgment. And even then, your employer might pay you with a potato, a handshake, or the promise of good exposure if you worked hard enough. Meanwhile, the baker's coin purse looked awfully full, and unattended. So yes, people stole, not because they were criminal masterminds, but because it was often a choice between theft and slow, ornamental starvation. But the thing is, it didn't take much to become a criminal. Steal a loaf of bread? That's theft. Pick up an apple that fell off a cart? Theft. Chase a runaway chicken and accidentally enter someone else's garden? Guess what? You're now trespassing and probably guilty of poultry conspiracy. And once you dipped a toe into that muddy legal pond, you were marked. You were now that kind of person. And in a time when gossip moved faster than carts and memory was long, especially for drama, it stuck. So, let's say you've committed to the life of theft. You're limber. You're motivated. You've tied a rag around your face to look mysterious. Great. Time to find a target. Except, good luck with that. You see, the biggest problem with being a medieval thief, other than the constant risk of hanging, is that nobody had anything worth stealing. Most villagers were poor, not can't afford new shoes poor, more like this potato is both dinner and pillow poor. The average peasant owned maybe one pair of trousers, 2 spoons, and a goat named after a family member. Their homes were made of mud, sticks, and optimism. They didn't have jewellery. They didn't have coin purses. Some of them didn't even have purses. They just tied things into bits of cloth and hoped for the best. You might get excited seeing someone in the market with a bulging pouch, only to find it's full of turnip seeds and a dead mouse. Congratulations. You've just risked your life for ingredients and rodent protein. You'd think nobles were better targets. They had gold after all. But they also had guards, dogs, fortresses, and an unhealthy enthusiasm for punishing people who touched their hats the wrong way. Robbing a noble was like walking into a wasp nest with a torch and hoping the wasps were polite. Then, there were the clergy. Churches had chalices and silver crosses, yes, but also locked doors, divine judgment, and more importantly, town gossip. Steal from the church, and everyone knew by lunch. Also, you might get cursed. Even if you didn't believe in curses, it still ruined your week. And don't even think about grave robbing. First of all, medieval cemeteries weren't exactly Fort Knox. They were barely organised. You could spend half the night digging only to find a pile of rocks and a very annoyed mole. Plus, exhuming bodies meant people assumed you were into dark magic, which came with additional problems. Being a thief in medieval Europe required a certain level of stealth, moving quietly through the shadows, slipping past sleeping guards, vanishing into the mist like a mysterious, misunderstood anti-hero. That was the dream. The reality? You smelled like a bag of boiled onions left in a goat's sock. Hygiene wasn't exactly a medieval priority. Baths were rare, soap was expensive, and deodorant hadn't been invented yet, unless you counted stuffing your shirt with dried herbs and hoping people mistook you for a mobile salad. And thieves? They weren't exactly living in comfort. Most slept in haystacks, alleys, or under pigs. You absorbed the environment, not in a poetic way, in a your body is now 30% barnyard way. So when you crept up behind someone in the marketplace, they usually heard you coming. Not by sound, by scent. You might as well have worn a sign that said, "I have not seen clean water since Lent." Your clothing didn't help. Most thieves wore the same outfit every day because it was the only one they owned. After a few nights of hiding in chimneys or crouching behind fish stalls, that outfit developed a personality. The kind of personality that clears a room. Even worse. Your job required physical activity. Running, jumping, crouching, all in heavy woolen clothes that trapped every molecule of body odour like a cursed sponge. You were a walking scent crime. Guards didn't need dogs to track you. They just followed the faint trail of sweat, mould, and bad life choices. Did you hear that? No, but I smelled it. Not exactly the mystique most thieves hoped for. And if you thought you could blend into a crowd to escape, think again. Medieval crowds were full of people who also hadn't bathed. Yes, but you. You were worse. Somehow. You stood out. You were the human equivalent of a warning. It's hard to be invisible when everyone around you is quietly gagging and opening windows. Dogs. Man's best friend. Unless, of course, you were a medieval thief. In which case, dogs were traitorous furry snitches with teeth. Every village, farmstead and roadside tavern had one. Not the floppy-eared, tail-wagging, who's a good boy kind we know today. No. These were wiry, half-feral creatures with scars, names like Chopper or Bitey, and the temper of a drunk blacksmith with gout. You didn't pet them. You prayed they didn't detect your presence through the fog. To a thief, dogs were the worst kind of security system. Cheap, loyal, and prone to dramatic barking at everything. It didn't matter how quiet you were. Step on a twig? Bark. Sneeze into your sleeve? Bark. Breathe slightly near the pantry door? You'd better believe bark. And now the entire street knows you're trying to liberate that wheel of cheese. And they weren't just noisy. They were fast. Dogs could cross muddy courtyards in seconds. Meanwhile, you're slipping on cabbage leaves and tripping over buckets. Suddenly, the quick job turns into a frantic race between your questionable cardio and a set of yellowed fangs. Getting bitten wasn't even the worst part. The real issue? Once a dog hated you, and they always did. It never forgot. Medieval dogs had memories like grudge-holding grandparents. You could rob a bakery once in spring, and 3 months later, that same dog would be waiting for you outside the alehouse, ready for round 2. Even worse, the townspeople loved their dogs more than their relatives. If a guard dog barked at you, people didn't ask questions. Oh, Bitey's barking. Must be a thief. Grab a pitchfork and tell the priest to prep the confession chair. You couldn't bribe them, reason with them, or outrun them forever. They didn't care if you were just trying to swipe a loaf of bread for your starving sibling. As far as they were concerned, you were an intruder, and your legs were made of chew toys. Here's the ironic thing. Most medieval homes didn't have locks. Not because people were trusting, but because locks were expensive, complex, and usually reserved for things like monasteries, city gates, or chests that definitely contained 3 rusty spoons and a saint's toenail. So you might think, perfect, easy pickings for me, the nimble village sneak thief. Not quite. Because while locks were rare, traps were not. People couldn't afford keys, so they got creative. And by creative, I mean actively hostile. It began with the door itself. Most weren't doors so much as wooden slabs that creaked like tortured souls and groaned when touched. Try opening one quietly, and you'd trigger an audio alarm louder than a cathedral bell. And that was the easy part. Many villagers hung crude bells on strings just inside, a medieval motion detector, if you will. Pull the door. Jingle jangle. Entire household awake. Baby crying. Dog barking. Someone screaming, "Get the pitchfork." You've lost the element of surprise and possibly a finger. Then there were the improvised defences. Some people leaned buckets of water above the door. Others scattered dry twigs across the floor so any sneaky step would crunch like you were stepping on a bowl of angry granola. And in rural areas, traps involved sharp farm tools, low-hanging beams, or, in one recorded case, a welcome mat made of hedgehogs. Let's not forget the poultry alarm system. Chickens. You'd think they'd be neutral. But no. Medieval chickens were nervous, shrieking nightmares that exploded into chaos the moment they sensed movement. One flap, and suddenly the courtyard sounds like a demon choir. And if you ever made it past the door, congratulations, you'd now meet the family goose. Geese were the unholy fusion of burglar alarm, bouncer, and emotional terrorist. They didn't just honk, they charged, fast, with beaks, and they held grudges. In short, the lack of a lock didn't mean welcome. It meant, go ahead, try it, we dare you. Every peasant was a part-time security expert, not because they were paranoid, but because they had stuff worth protecting, and no spare spoons. Let's say you've somehow evaded the angry dog, the suspicious goose, and the door that shrieked like a ghost on fire. You're inside. Success. Now you just have to sneak past the sleeping family and nab a pouch of coins. Except, bad news. Nobody was really asleep in medieval times. People didn't sleep in blissful, silent REM cycles. They slept like anxious squirrels, half-conscious, one ear open, and usually holding something sharp. You see, being alive in the Middle Ages was a contact sport. Bandits, plague, taxes, wild boars. It was a daily buffet of potential doom. So when people went to bed, they didn't do it peacefully. They slept in shifts, with one eye cracked open and their favourite stabbing implement close at hand. And we're not talking about swords or dramatic daggers. We're talking about fireplace pokers, pitchforks, ladles that doubled as skull crackers, and the occasional suspiciously sharpened spoon. If it could dent your forehead, it was bedtime ready. Even peasants with families didn't trust the darkness. Parents slept with their kids huddled close, not out of love, but because it was easier to defend them all from one centralized pile. You know, like human Tetris, but angry. And don't assume there was a guest room to tiptoe past. Medieval houses were basically one big room. Beds? If you were lucky. Otherwise, straw mats and a goat that snored. You could barely walk without stepping on someone's cousin or a butter churn. You weren't sneaking. You were dodging obstacles like a medieval ninja warrior contestant. Oh, and let's not forget the soundscape. Every house had creaky floors, sputtering firelight, and that one sleeper who definitely talked in their sleep. More than one thief was caught mid-heist when someone suddenly shouted, "You stole my pies!" in a dream, and everyone bolted upright. The truth is, no one truly slept deeply in medieval times. They just powered down enough to survive and restart the next miserable day. And if a floorboard creaked at the wrong hour, that wasn't a noise. That was an invitation to attack something. Getting caught as a medieval thief wasn't just a bad day. It was a permanent lifestyle change. And not in the "you learned your lesson" way. More like the "they burned a letter into your face and now even the village goats judge you" way. Yes, branding was real. And not the cool kind where you build a personal aesthetic and Instagram following. No, this was actual red-hot iron pressed into your flesh, courtesy of the local constable with all the bedside manner of a bear trap. Steal once, and you'd be marked for life, usually with a T for thief, a V for vagabond, or sometimes just a nice sizzling stripe across your forehead because creativity was limited, but cruelty was abundant. The point wasn't justice, it was visibility. The medieval justice system believed shame should be portable. That way, everyone knew what you'd done, even if you weren't currently doing it. Think of it like wearing a name tag that says, "Hi, I steal things," only written in scar tissue and judgment. And once you were branded, good luck with everything. Want a job? Nope. Want a room at the inn? Absolutely not. Want to buy a carrot without the vendor nervously checking their inventory? Think again. Even worse, the branding process wasn't always done by professionals. Sometimes it was the local blacksmith after a few ales. Sometimes it was a priest who swore he read about it in a book once. The results varied. Sometimes it looked like a letter. Sometimes it looked like your face had lost a wrestling match with a fireplace. And heaven help you if you got caught a second time. Because now they had to get creative, branding in new places, chopping fingers, shaving half your head, which, by the way, was apparently the medieval equivalent of a social media takedown. In theory, medieval justice had a system. In practice, that system often looked like 20 angry villagers, one slippery accusation, and a hay fork with opinions. Welcome to trial by mob, the go-to legal process for thieves who were caught red-handed, red-faced, or just unlucky enough to look suspicious near someone else's pie. See, if a medieval crowd believed you stole something, they didn't call a lawyer. They called everyone else, neighbours, shopkeepers, children with no context but lots of enthusiasm. Suddenly, you weren't in trouble with the authorities. You were in trouble with Marjorie, who remembers when you looked funny at her geese 2 months ago. And once the mob had gathered, forget innocent until proven guilty. That idea was about 500 years, and one enlightenment away. You were guilty the moment someone shouted, "That's him!" Bonus guilt if your clothes were torn, your hair was wild, or you didn't live within shouting distance. Your trial usually began with yelling, escalated to grabbing, and ended with something being thrown at your head. Possibly a shoe, possibly a turnip, possibly a goat. Medieval mobs were unpredictable but deeply committed. If you were lucky, someone with an official title showed up. A constable maybe, a monk if you were really blessed. But often, you were at the mercy of local justice, which meant you'd be tied to a post in the square while everyone took turns describing how their day had been ruined, specifically because of you. The evidence? Circumstantial. The verdict? Decided by volume. The sentence? Creative. Sometimes it was public shaming, stocks, pillories, or being forced to wear a sign that said something like, "I steal eggs and lie to my aunt." Sometimes it was a beating. Sometimes it was being dunked in the river while people yelled things like, "Confess!" and "I told you he looked like a sock thief." Appeals? None. Defense? You could try shouting, "It wasn't me," but that mostly made people throw harder. Mob justice didn't aim for truth. It aimed for closure. Fast, loud, cathartic closure. You've been caught. The mobs had their fun. Maybe they didn't kill you. Congratulations. You've been deemed worthy of public humiliation instead. Enter the stocks. Now, if you're imagining a quiet time out to reflect on your choices, no. Stocks weren't punishment light. They were medieval entertainment. You were the show, and not a good one. More like a local improv group made entirely of humiliation and leg cramps. First, let's define them. Stocks were large wooden frames that locked your ankles, and sometimes your wrists, into place. You sat awkwardly in a public square, hunched like a badly folded deck chair, with your limbs stretched out and your dignity leaking from every pore. And you stayed there, for hours, sometimes days. Rain? Tough? Snow? Too bad. Pigeons landing on your head? Welcome to your new normal. But the weather wasn't the worst part. The people were. Passers-by were encouraged to mock you, loudly, creatively. They'd throw things, spoiled food, manure, whatever was nearby and unpleasant. Children especially enjoyed this. It was a community bonding moment, like a holiday. but smellier and more personal. "Hey, that's the guy who stole the blacksmith's sausage," someone would shout. Then the sausage, now very stale, would be hurled directly at your face, and don't think you could tune it out. Stocks were deliberately uncomfortable. Your legs went numb, your back ached, and your nose ran while villagers composed folk songs about your criminal incompetence. You might get lucky and have a sympathetic friend sneak you some bread. More likely, though, someone stole your food while mocking your theft record. That's irony, medieval style. And let's not forget the long-term effects. After a public stock session, you were marked. Not physically, but socially. People remembered. You were now that guy from the stocks. It stuck longer than the cabbage in your hair. Also, if you thought this was the lowest tier of punishment, think again. The stocks were practically a spa day compared to what came next. Branding, mutilation, or a one-way ticket to the gallows, courtesy of your local execution enthusiast. By medieval standards, a flogging was considered merciful. Not because it was painless, far from it, but because it meant you still had your limbs, your life, and a chance to limp home afterward. In a world where punishment often included branding, dismemberment, or the kind of community engagement that ended with a funeral, a good old-fashioned flogging was almost polite. Let's set the scene. You've been caught stealing, perhaps a loaf of bread or someone's spare boots. You're hauled into the town square, surrounded by people who definitely don't have anything better to do, and the local authority gives the nod. Out comes the whip, not the movie-style leather one. This is more of a rough rope or a strip of knotted hide, wielded by someone who's either very enthusiastic or just having a bad day. You're tied to a post, always a public spot, so the town gets a free show. You might be shirtless, but only because torn clothes aren't great protection. There's no dramatic music, just the sound of rope hitting skin, and someone in the crowd saying something like, "Serves him right. I always suspected he looked like a bread thief." The goal wasn't just pain, it was deterrence. You weren't just being punished, you were being used as a living lesson. "Steal, and this could be you," the lash said, over and over again, like a very violent motivational speaker. The lash count varied, 5, 10, 20, depending on the crime, the mood of the judge, or whether the person administering it had a sore shoulder that day. And if you passed out mid-punishment, that was fine. They'd just pause, splash water on your face, and continue. Hydration was important after all. But here's the thing. If you were flogged, it meant someone had decided not to go further. You weren't locked away forever. You weren't branded or worse. You were punished, yes. But then you were released, bruised, embarrassed, but alive. So you've just swiped a purse, maybe nabbed a wedge of cheese. Excellent, you're on the run. Now what? Well, unless you had a flawlessly timed horse waiting behind the tannery, and let's be honest, you didn't, your getaway looked a lot more like awkward power walking through mud while villagers shouted, "Stop! Thief!" and someone's grandmother tried to trip you with a broom. Medieval towns weren't exactly built for clean escapes. Streets were narrow, twisted, and usually clogged with carts, pigs, or someone arguing loudly with a monk. Cobblestones were uneven, and if it had rained recently, and it always had, you were ankle-deep in a mystery stew of mud, straw, and regret. And footwear. Don't get your hopes up. You were probably wearing worn-out leather shoes tied together with string. Or worse, you were barefoot. Running away from an angry butcher while your feet are actively bleeding is a deeply humbling experience. You might think, "I'll duck into an alley." Great. Except most alleys weren't alleys. They were dead ends. Or worse, communal latrines. Many a daring escape was cut tragically short by an unexpected wall, or a waist-high pile of something best left unnamed. Even if you made it out of the village, the countryside wasn't your friend either. Open fields left you exposed, and forests were full of people exactly like you, who would absolutely rob you the moment you stumbled in with a stolen pie and a limp. It's hard to enjoy the fruits of crime when another criminal is eyeing your fruit. And let's not forget the locals. They didn't sit back and say, "Oh, we'll let the guards handle it." No, chasing thieves was a team sport. Farmers, merchants, children, that one guy who just really liked shouting, all of them would join the pursuit. And they weren't chasing you out of civic duty. They just wanted to be part of something. So you've made it through the mud, dodged the pitchforks, and maybe even kept the stolen sausage. Time to lie low and regroup. But here's the twist. Medieval criminals weren't a merry band of lovable rogues. They were a grim collection of opportunists, outcasts, and people who would absolutely steal your socks while helping you hide. See, the term organised crime was a little optimistic in medieval Europe. Thieves didn't form elegant guilds or meet in candlelit taverns to discuss codes of honour. They squatted in ruined buildings, fought over crumbs, and turned each other in for half a crust of bread and a pat on the head from the local sheriff. These were not your allies. They were your competition. The more desperate the times, the more dangerous the thieves. You weren't rubbing elbows with Robin Hood. You were huddled next to someone named Rancid Thomas, who once bit a guy over a turnip. And Thomas, he'd sell you out in a heartbeat, and then sell your shoes a minute later. Trust was a luxury, and loyalty came second to self-preservation. If you had a safe hideout, someone would find it and borrow everything. If you had food, you were suddenly everyone's best friend, until you fell asleep. Even worse, these people drew attention. The kind you didn't want. Drunken brawls in the street, shouting about stolen spoons, getting caught and naming every person they'd ever met, including you and your cousin and probably your goat. It was a circus, a badly run one. And if you dared to rise above, to be, say, a thief with a code, you'd still end up lumped in with the worst of them. To the townsfolk, a thief was a thief. It didn't matter if you only stole to survive while others robbed churches and insulted chickens. In the public eye, you were all part of the same smelly, morally bankrupt pie. You might imagine that getting caught meant going to prison. A medieval stone dungeon with iron bars, straw beds, and a tragic roommate named Gareth. Maybe you picture rats, some slow redemption arc, and someone slipping you bread through a slot in the door. Wrong. Medieval prisons weren't punishment. They were holding pens, glorified broom closets for people waiting to be publicly shamed, fined, or if your week was going really badly, executed. If you were lucky enough to land in a prison, and that's a sentence we never thought we'd say, it was less institution and more wet hole in the ground. Literally. Many jails were dug into the earth beneath castles, town halls, or someone's spare barn. Ventilation? Optional? Sanitation? Non-existent. You weren't doing time. You were doing mildew. Forget privacy. You were tossed into a shared pit with whoever else had annoyed the authorities that week. Drunkards, arsonists, suspicious-looking peasants, a guy who accidentally insulted the bishop's horse. All of you packed together like sad, damp sardines. Beds? No. Blankets? Also no. Food? Only if someone felt charitable. Or if your family could bribe the guard with coins, favours, or a particularly fine turnip. Otherwise, you lived off scraps, rainwater, and your own terrible life choices. And then came the boredom. No trials, no schedules. Just sitting, waiting, smelling things that could legally be classified as weapons. Sometimes you waited for a trial. Other times, you waited for someone important to remember you were there. Of course, not everyone got a prison cell. If your crime was bad enough, or if the jail was full, you were just chained up outside, in the rain, on display. It was a great opportunity for passing strangers to comment on your moral failings while throwing cabbage. You might think, well, at least I'm not dead. And sure, technically that's a win. But after a week ankle-deep in your own regret, even the town gallows started to feel like an early release program. If you were a medieval thief who finally ran out of luck, or chickens to blame, the end of the line often involved rope, a wooden platform, and a very public calendar event known as Market Day Execution. Yes, the gallows had a schedule. These things were planned. You weren't just quietly removed in the night. Oh no, your final performance was a community experience. Children were brought along. Vendors sold snacks. If you were particularly infamous, someone might write a rude little ballad about you. The medieval version of going viral. And the worst part? They usually made you wait. You might be told on Monday, "You're being hanged on Friday." So you had the joy of stewing in fear while listening to the guards practice jokes about your last words. By the time Friday rolled around, the whole town had gathered. Not because they hated you personally, though some definitely did, but because executions were a thing. Public punishment was the medieval version of reality TV. Everyone came for the drama, the spectacle, and possibly a roast chicken. Now the gallows themselves were fairly straightforward. A wooden structure, a rope, and a platform that dropped out from under your feet. The key detail? Efficiency. It wasn't about ceremony. It was about getting it done and moving on with the day. You didn't get a final meal. You didn't get last words unless the executioner was in a generous mood or needed a bathroom break. If you were lucky, the rope was tied correctly and your neck snapped instantly. If you were unlucky, and let's be honest, you were a medieval thief, so luck wasn't your strong suit. The rope stretched and things got awkward. And just in case you thought people would forget about you, they didn't. Your body might be left hanging for hours, sometimes days, as a reminder, like a gruesome billboard that said, "Shoplifting, not recommended." Occasionally, a well-meaning cleric might offer last rites. Occasionally, a local artist would sketch the whole thing in disturbing detail. But mostly, it was just you, gravity, and a town full of people whispering, "That's the guy who stole 3 onions." So let's say, somehow, you managed to avoid the dogs, the stocks, the branding iron, the gallows, and every angry goose between here and the city gates. You survived. You even pulled off a few decent hauls. A coin pouch here, a roast duck there. Congratulations. You're what passes for a successful medieval thief. Now what? Retirement? Oh, sweet summer peasant. Retirement was not a thing. There was no pension plan, no seaside cottage to write your memoirs, no peaceful sunset years surrounded by grandchildren asking how you once escaped a bishop's pantry. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to become too slow to steal and too grizzled to be worth arresting. That just meant you graduated to begging, the medieval version of consulting. And even that wasn't easy. Cities had official beggar permits. No, really. If you didn't have one, you were just a criminal with fewer cardio skills. Begging without a license could get you kicked out of town, or into a ditch. Some thieves tried to go straight. Maybe become a labourer. Problem is, you're still branded, still infamous, and still missing 3 teeth and a solid resume. When your references include escaped a cellar once and knows how to climb a wall in under 30 seconds, employers tend to look elsewhere. And let's not forget the other charming option, becoming an informant. You turn in your old friends for a few coins and a pat on the back until someone recognizes you, and then you become the story of the week at the local gallows. So no, there was no retirement plan, no thieves' union, no quiet fade into obscurity. Your options were, keep stealing until you're caught. Try begging and still possibly get caught. Join a mercenary band and probably get stabbed by someone worse than you. Disappear into the forest and become folklore, preferably the mysterious thief who vanished after one last job, though more likely, guy who died in a puddle near a bush. So when people say, crime doesn't pay, in the medieval world, they weren't joking. It paid in bruises, scars, and a lifetime of looking over your shoulder. It started with good intentions, or at least that's what the official reports claimed. In the early 1800s, Britain was being swallowed whole by industrialisation. Cities like London and Manchester were bursting at the seams, overflowing with factory smoke, horse dung, and something society feared far more than poverty: madness. The old model of dealing with the mentally ill, chaining them in private madhouses, locking them in poorhouses, or hiding them behind closed doors, was no longer enough. Reformers like the Quaker William Tuke in York had already begun to experiment with something radical: kindness. His moral treatment model rejected whips and beatings in favour of gardens, fresh air, and human decency. For a moment, it looked like the dawn of a more humane age, but progress has a way of turning sour. The 1808 County Asylums Act changed everything. It allowed local governments across England and Wales to build public asylums funded by taxes. And that's exactly what they did, by the dozen. By mid-century, asylums had become sprawling institutions on the edge of every major town. Their architecture was Gothic, ominous, and fortress-like. They were supposed to be temples of healing. Instead, they became warehouses for the unwanted. The problem wasn't the concept. It was the execution. These new public asylums weren't just for the violently insane. They became dumping grounds for the inconvenient. Unmarried mothers, alcoholics, epileptics, paupers, menopausal women, anyone who caused a scene or failed to follow Victorian norms could end up inside. Diagnoses were vague, often sexist, and deeply moralistic. If you were a woman with opinions, you might be labelled hysterical. If you were a man who didn't work hard enough, you might be accused of melancholia or moral insanity. And once you were inside, it was hard to get out. Asylums ballooned in size. What began as institutions for 50 or 60 patients swelled to house thousands. Overcrowding exploded. Funding couldn't keep up. The staff-to-patient ratio collapsed. Moral treatment gave way to containment. Straitjackets replaced gardens. Cold baths replaced conversation. In theory, Victorian asylums were a beacon of scientific progress. In practice, they became the padded cells where progress was left to rot. And this was only the beginning. So, what made someone mad in the Victorian era? That depended less on science and more on your social status, gender, and whether your neighbours thought you were a bit odd. Diagnoses in the 19th century were a cocktail of superstition, pseudoscience, and moral judgment. Shaken, not stirred. Medical professionals, known as alienists, had enormous power and shockingly little evidence. They worked from thick manuals listing supposed causes of insanity that included everything from overwork and religious fervour to masturbation and reading novels. Yes, reading novels, especially if you were a woman. Victorian doctors were obsessed with female hysteria, a condition so poorly defined it became a catch-all diagnosis for anything deemed emotionally inconvenient. Mood swings, sexual desire, defiance, grief. A widow who cried too long, hysterical. A woman who resisted her husband's advances, hysterical. An unmarried woman past 30, definitely hysterical. Men, too, weren't safe from moral judgment disguised as medicine. Alcoholism, idleness, self-abuse, or simply being melancholic could all earn a one-way ticket to the asylum. The diagnosis of moral insanity became especially popular. It described those who behaved badly without appearing outwardly delusional. In other words, the Victorian way of saying, "We don't like this guy." Once committed, often by a family member or a local magistrate, the patient was trapped in a system that offered few checks and balances. The legal requirement for commitment? 2 medical certificates. That's it. No court trial, no patient consent, no appeal. There were even cases of women committed by husbands for questioning their authority, or disturbingly, to get rid of them entirely. Divorce was scandalous and expensive. The asylum was cheaper. Inside, the patient's diagnosis dictated everything: their meals, their cell or room if they were lucky, and even whether they could speak or be spoken to. Those labelled excitable might be kept in silence. The violent were confined to locked rooms. If you were rich or well-connected, you might get a private cell with a window. If not, you shared your cell with dozens, and rats. To the Victorian medical mind, insanity was often rooted in weakness, moral, spiritual, or sexual. Cures were unlikely, control was the goal. And so, The line between madness and inconvenience blurred. Diagnosis became a tool of social discipline, more about conformity than care. And as we'll soon see, the treatment was often worse than the disease. Once you were labelled insane and locked away, the next step was treatment. But in Victorian mental asylums, that word didn't mean what you think it means. Forget therapy sessions or medication. Treatment was often just a sanitized term for discipline, or punishment disguised as medicine. Early on, some asylums clung to the ideal of moral therapy, which emphasized calm environments, routine, fresh air, and kindness. But as patient numbers exploded and funding shrank, doctors turned to faster, more forceful methods. Cold water immersion was a favorite. Patients were plunged into ice baths, not to refresh them, but to shock their nervous system into submission. Some were kept in tubs for hours, strapped down, trembling and silent. The theory? That madness could be cooled off. The reality? Hypothermia, trauma, and despair. Another popular technique was the tranquilizer chair, a sinister device invented by Dr. Benjamin Rush. Patients were strapped in, often blindfolded, with their limbs restrained, and sometimes a box placed over their heads to block out sound. This was meant to calm the senses. In practice, it was solitary confinement with extra humiliation. Electricity soon entered the mix. Before modern electroconvulsive therapy, Victorians experimented with rudimentary electrical devices, crude and often dangerous. Patients were zapped in an attempt to stimulate dormant brain areas or restore sanity. In reality, it mostly left them frightened, burned, or worse. Bleeding and purging were still in use too, holdovers from medieval medicine. Doctors believed an imbalance in bodily fluids caused madness, so out came the leeches and laxatives. Some even drilled holes into patients' skulls to release pressure, a procedure with roots in ancient trepanation and about the same success rate, 0. For women, treatments often had a deeply sexist edge. Hysteria might be treated with enforced celibacy, genital surgeries, or, if the doctor was particularly depraved, manual stimulation, which gave rise to the invention of the vibrator. Yes, the first vibrators were medical devices designed by Victorian doctors who thought female orgasms cured insanity. And then there was sedation. Chloral hydrate and opiates were used liberally, not to heal, but to silence. Patients were rendered docile, zombie-like, easy to manage, especially in overcrowded asylums with one nurse for every 50 inmates. Victorian asylums didn't heal minds. They broke them, systematically, coldly, and often with the approval of the medical establishment. And still, somehow it would get worse. If you were to approach a Victorian mental asylum from the outside, it might look majestic. Grand stone facades, manicured gardens, sweeping driveways. But don't be fooled. These buildings were designed less for healing and more for containment. The architecture of the Victorian asylum was deeply symbolic. It reflected the era's obsession with order, hierarchy, and surveillance. Many institutions followed a rigid design known as the corridor plan or the pavilion system, a layout that allowed patients to be strictly segregated by gender, diagnosis, or behavior. Women on one wing, men on the other. Quiet patients near the center, noisy or violent ones pushed to the edges. The asylum was a fortress of discipline. Windows were high and narrow, doors locked from the outside. Hallways echoed with every footstep, amplifying even the smallest sounds. Furniture was bolted to the floors. Beds were iron-framed and thin. There were no personal items, no privacy, and certainly no warmth. Every detail of the structure screamed, "You are not free." At the center of many institutions stood the superintendent's office, always with a view of the wards, a constant reminder that you were being watched. Think of it as a psychological panopticon. You never knew exactly when you were under observation, which meant you always behaved as if you were. Even the landscaping played a role. Gardens weren't just for aesthetics. They were tools of pacification. Patients were expected to work in them, pruning hedges and hauling soil, as part of their moral rehabilitation. In reality, it was unpaid labour designed to keep them busy and tired. Then came the airing courts, walled outdoor enclosures where patients were marched for fresh air. These weren't spaces of leisure. They were more like outdoor cells. Men and women walked in circles under the gaze of attendants. Talking was discouraged. Laughter was suspicious. Inside the asylum, the rules were suffocating. You needed permission to speak, to sit, to stand, even to use the toilet. Infractions were met with punishment, isolation, restraints, or worse. Even hope became dangerous. Grandiose delusions could include thinking you'd ever leave. The Victorian asylum was a machine. A cold, efficient mechanism designed to categorize, restrain, and forget those deemed unfit for the world outside. And once the door closed behind you, it often stayed that way for life. If you were a woman in Victorian Britain, the asylum loomed like a silent threat behind every social misstep. The 19th century was a golden age for patriarchy. Women were expected to be docile, obedient, and quietly miserable. Anything outside that narrow ideal, too loud, too sexual, too sad, too clever, could be interpreted as madness. And the asylum was always hiring. Husbands could commit their wives with frightening ease. All it took were 2 medical signatures, no trial, no defense, no requirement for evidence. In one infamous case, a woman was institutionalized for having religious excitement after attending too many church services. In another, a wife was locked up for arguing about money. But not all cases were so benignly absurd. Some were horrifying. Women who had experienced trauma, sexual abuse, postpartum depression, or miscarriages were often accused of hysteria. Rather than being given support, they were locked away, subjected to invasive cures, and left to rot in understaffed wards. Victorian medicine didn't treat their pain, it pathologized it. Even menopause was suspect. Doctors labelled it a dangerous time for female mental instability. Mood swings, hot flashes, and irritability were treated not as natural processes, but as signs of climacteric insanity. Translation: middle-aged women had lost their minds and must be restrained. Teenage girls didn't fare better. A rebellious daughter, too flirtatious or too bookish, might be sent to an asylum for her own good. Once inside, her youth and vulnerability made her especially susceptible to abuse, from both staff and other patients, and she might never leave. Sexuality was perhaps the most common justification for locking women away. The Victorian era was obsessed with female chastity, and any deviation from this ideal, real or imagined, was grounds for medicalized confinement. Masturbation, infidelity, even excessive romantic imagination were treated as symptoms of madness. Treatment methods often doubled as sexual control. Doctors performed clitoridectomies and other surgeries, claiming they cured hysteria or nymphomania. In reality, they were acts of violence designed to erase pleasure and enforce submission. The asylum became a tool of social control, especially for women, a place where inconvenient wives, curious daughters, and grieving mothers could be removed, silenced, and forgotten. The walls didn't just contain madness, they institutionalized misogyny, and no one on the outside dared ask too many questions. When we picture Victorian asylums, we often imagine adults pacing the corridors in nightgowns, whispering to themselves or staring out barred windows. But many of the most overlooked victims were at both ends of life's timeline, the very young and the very old. Children were not spared the asylum's reach. Victorian society didn't fully recognize childhood as a distinct psychological stage. A child who was too unruly, slow to learn, or showed signs of neurological disorders like epilepsy or autism was often labelled idiotic or feeble-minded. There was little understanding and even less compassion. Entire wings of asylums and later separate institutions called idiot asylums were built to house these children. Their treatments were basic at best, abusive at worst. Many were left to rock in corners or restrained for hours. Education was limited to repetitive tasks, if offered at all. Some were sterilized in the name of eugenics. And because their families were ashamed or too poor to care for them, many children spent their entire lives behind asylum walls. Then there were the elderly, especially those suffering from what we now recognize as dementia, Parkinson's, or age-related psychosis. Back then, these conditions were lumped together under terms like senile insanity. The elderly poor, in particular, had few options. If they were alone, confused, or simply couldn't manage their lives, the asylum beckoned. Victorian workhouses were often the first stop, brutal institutions designed to punish poverty. But when an older person began to show signs of mental deterioration, the workhouse would pass them along to the asylum system. There, they were locked away with little hope of release or specialized care. Inmates too young to understand, or too old to resist shared overcrowded dormitories, endured the same regimens and were often forgotten entirely. Lacking advocates, these groups suffered in silence. No letters, no visitors, no voice. And because they weren't violent or disruptive, they were often ignored by the staff. Just another warm body to sedate, bathe and feed. These patients weren't treated as individuals. They were considered burdens, mouths to feed in a system already stretched to its breaking point. In many asylums, children died of neglect, elderly patients died of exposure, and no one kept proper records. In a world obsessed with order and morality, youth and age were just two more ways to fall short, and two more reasons to be locked away. Not everyone turned a blind eye to the horrors inside the asylum walls. By the mid to late 19th century, cracks had begun to show in the public image of mental institutions. Scandals leaked out. Patients were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Whistleblowers began to speak up, and reformers seized the moment. One of the earliest and most vocal advocates for change was Dorothea Dix, an American activist who toured British institutions and was appalled by what she saw. She wasn't alone. In England, figures like Louisa Lowe and John Percival, the son of a British Prime Minister who had himself been institutionalized, began publishing pamphlets and testimonies that exposed abuse, false imprisonments, and unspeakable living conditions. These accounts were damning. Patients chained for weeks. Women sedated to silence their cries of protest. Sanitary conditions that rivaled those of prisons, or worse. Some institutions, like Hanwell or Colney Hatch, became infamous for their sheer scale and brutality. In 1859, Parliament passed the Lunacy Act, which attempted to standardise asylum regulations. A board of commissioners in lunacy was formed to inspect institutions and protect patient rights. But in practice, inspections were sporadic and superficial. Superintendents had time to tidy things up before visits, and abuse continued in quieter corners. Meanwhile, journalists began sniffing around. Undercover investigations revealed that many patients weren't mad at all. They were poor, difficult, inconvenient, or victims of family betrayals. The newspapers ate it up. Public outrage simmered. Reform-minded doctors, too, began to question the system. Some experimented with occupational therapy, music, and recreation. They called for better training for attendants and higher standards of care. A few institutions even introduced open wards, where patients were not locked inside and could roam the grounds, a revolutionary idea at the time. But these improvements were uneven at best. For every progressive asylum, there were 10 where nothing changed. Why? Because the system was profitable. Families could pay to have a relative quietly removed. Local governments saved face by hiding the visibly unwell. And the public preferred the illusion of care to the discomfort of reality. The reformers made noise, yes, but the machine kept humming. And while some patients found their voices and champions, most remained locked away, quiet, forgotten, and increasingly hopeless. The age of reform had begun, but it was far from finished. In Victorian society, madness wasn't just feared, it was watched. Asylums, ironically, were not always hidden from public view. In fact, They often became local attractions. Visitors, curious, bored, or just plain morbid, could buy tickets to tour the wards. It was part spectacle, part moral instruction. Look how fortunate you are not to be like them. This wasn't an exaggeration. Middle and upper-class Victorians treated asylum visits like museum outings. Families would pack a lunch, ride their carriages to the local lunatic hospital, and stroll past the barred windows and padded cells like they were viewing zoo animals. Sometimes, attendants would point out particularly entertaining patients, those who raved, danced, or shouted at the walls. It was theatre. But the cast never auditioned. Even the patients were aware of it. Some wrote letters begging to be spared the humiliation of being on display. Others performed madness, believing that acting insane enough might secure release, or at least some attention. But the spectacle went beyond voyeurism. The asylum also became a tool of political theatre. Doctors gave public lectures inside their institutions, showcasing their success stories and methods. Patients were trotted out like trophies, often still suffering, but coached to say they were improving. These exhibitions reassured donors and officials that their money wasn't being wasted. Photography played its part too. The Victorian era saw the birth of psychiatric portraiture. Solemn, eerie images of patients posed stiffly, sometimes with signs listing their diagnosis. These weren't for family albums, they were for medical journals and public display, reinforcing the idea that insanity had a look, a type. These faces became the propaganda of control. And of course, literature and theatre loved the asylum trope. Gothic novels like Jane Eyre and The Woman in White used the mad woman in the attic as both villain and victim, always isolated, often imprisoned, rarely understood. These stories mirrored society's real anxieties about women, class, power, and the thin line between sanity and rebellion. In truth, Victorian asylums didn't just house the mad, they helped define what madness meant. They were social mirrors, reflecting everything the era feared: disorder, deviance, sexuality, and loss of control. And for many, being labelled insane was not the end of a journey. It was a lifelong sentence written in whispers and watched through iron bars. By the end of the Victorian era, the asylum system had become a paradox, born from reform, fed by fear, and sustained by silence. Institutions meant to offer sanctuary had become places of permanent exile. The 20th century would eventually bring changes, some overdue, some still flawed, but the shadows cast by Victorian mental asylums linger even now. Many of the beliefs that shaped those institutions didn't vanish overnight. Ideas about undesirable behaviour, gender roles, and moral madness slowly bled into modern psychiatry, into criminal justice, even into how families handled illness behind closed doors. Many Victorian-era asylums stood for decades beyond their prime, vast crumbling buildings that became symbols of everything that went wrong. Some were converted into housing, others were demolished. A few were simply abandoned, their corridors left to rot with the graffiti of time still etched in the paint. But what about the people? Tens of thousands died inside those institutions, some from illness, some from abuse, many from sheer neglect. Their graves were often unmarked. Their files, if they survived, are now stored in archives with tragic footnotes like "never spoke again" or "believed to be possessed." They vanished behind stone walls and history moved on, yet their stories matter. Because the Victorian asylum wasn't just a physical structure, it was a cultural machine, one that taught society how to treat the vulnerable, isolate them, silence them, punish them for being inconvenient. And while we like to believe we've evolved, echoes of that system remain. In underfunded mental health care, in stigma, in families too ashamed to speak openly, in prisons overflowing with the mentally ill. There's no simple moral to the tale. The Victorians weren't cartoon villains. Many doctors truly believed they were helping. Some were kind. Some patients did improve, but intention doesn't erase impact. and what started as an attempt at compassion became a machinery of confinement, brutal, sprawling, and deeply human in its failures. Today we walk past the ruins of those asylums and barely glance at the plaques, but if you stop, you might feel it, that strange, heavy stillness. The residue of stories untold, lives forgotten, voices that were never heard. And maybe that's the legacy worth remembering, not just the institutions, but the people inside them. Because in the end, what we choose to forget says just as much as what we remember. Khutulun was not your average royal. From the moment of her birth around the year 1260, she was destined to defy expectations, not just as a woman, but as a warrior. She was born into the heart of the Mongol world, a nomadic empire that had conquered much of Eurasia in a single century. Her father, Kaidu Khan, was no minor chieftain. He was a formidable leader in his own right, a direct descendant of Ögedei Khan, Genghis Khan's third son. Kaidu ruled over the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia and was a fierce rival of his cousin, Kublai Khan, who ruled the wealthier eastern domains from China. The Mongol world was vast, but divided, and Kaidu was determined to preserve the traditional ways of the steppe, rugged, mobile, and rooted in martial prowess. From a young age, Khutulun was raised not as a sheltered princess, but as a warrior. In Mongol culture, girls were taught to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Archery, horseback hunting, and battlefield tactics were not exclusive to boys. But Khutulun took things further. She didn't just learn to fight, she excelled at it. By her teenage years, she was riding beside her father on military campaigns, commanding troops, and earning a reputation not just as a noblewoman, but as a devastating force of nature. According to chroniclers like Marco Polo and Rashid al-Din, Khutulun stood out even among the hardened warriors of her time. Her physical strength was legendary. She could pin grown men to the ground in wrestling matches. She could gallop into battle wielding a bow or spear with deadly precision. And she wasn't just a sideshow. She was a commander, feared by her enemies and respected by her allies. Her upbringing was unique in the Mongol world, but not entirely unprecedented. Mongol women had always enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in Europe or the Islamic world. Still, Khutulun shattered even those boundaries. She wasn't content to remain in the background, managing domestic affairs. She wanted to fight, lead, and challenge the very idea of what a royal woman could be. She was the daughter of a Khan, but she was also her own kind of conqueror, and soon the entire steppe would know her name. Of all the stories surrounding Khutulun, one tale echoes louder than the rest, a tale that turned her from warrior to legend. By the time she reached marriageable age, Khutulun had already proven herself in battle, outmaneuvered rival commanders, and solidified her place beside her father as a trusted military advisor. Yet one question lingered in the minds of every neighbouring ruler and royal court: who would marry her? Khutulun had an answer. She would only marry a man who could defeat her in wrestling. Not archery, not swordplay. Wrestling. This wasn't just a game. Mongol wrestling, or Burk, was an elite sport, one of the three manly skills alongside archery and horsemanship. It required strength, balance, endurance, and ferocious will. Matches could last for hours, and Khutulun didn't just participate, she dominated. She made her challenge public. Any man who wished to marry her must first best her on the wrestling field. If they lost, they had to forfeit a large number of horses, usually 100, but some legends say even more. And lose they did, one after another. Strongmen, warriors, nobles, each came with confidence and left with bruises and broken pride. Some accounts, particularly the dramatized ones by foreign travelers like Marco Polo, claim that Khutulun amassed a herd of 10,000 horses from these failed suitors. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear. She had turned traditional courtship into a trial of strength, and no man measured up. To her people, this wasn't scandalous. It was awe-inspiring. Khutulun became the embodiment of the steppe's ideals, fierce, free, and unconquered. Her defiance of convention didn't diminish her femininity, it redefined it. She didn't reject marriage outright, but she refused to surrender to weakness, status, or political convenience. Of course, her parents, especially her mother, were less enthused. Kaidu may have admired his daughter's prowess, but he also had dynastic ambitions. A strategic marriage could have secured alliances, but Khutulun held firm. She would not be bartered or bound, not unless her chosen match could take her down with his own strength. None ever did. This vow wasn't just about love. It was a statement, a living declaration that no man, no matter how rich or royal, could own her unless he earned it through force and respect. And in that ring, Khutulun remained undefeated. Khutulun wasn't just a champion in the wrestling ring, she was a terror on the battlefield. From her teenage years onward, she rode alongside her father, Kaidu Khan, as he led campaigns across Central Asia in his long-standing war against Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. These were no ceremonial rides. Khutulun fought in full armor, commanded troops, and made tactical decisions that earned her the fear and respect of seasoned generals. The Mongol way of war was brutal, fast, and highly coordinated. Cavalry maneuvers, feigned retreats, and ambushes were all part of the game, and Khutulun mastered it. One account, likely exaggerated but rooted in truth, claims she would ride into enemy lines and snatch up a prisoner as easily as a hawk plucks a chicken. This wasn't poetry. It was how Mongols assessed greatness, through action. Her battlefield prowess was so formidable that her father reportedly considered naming her as his heir, not just to his household or his horses, but to the leadership of the entire Chagatai Khanate. This was no small thing. Mongol politics were deeply patriarchal, especially when it came to succession. Leadership wasn't simply inherited, it had to be won, endorsed by powerful male nobles and military leaders. For Kaidu to even consider Khutulun as his successor meant she had done more than earn his trust. She had proven, time and again, that she was a commander equal to or better than her brothers, but therein lay the problem. Khutulun had many brothers, 15 by most counts, and not all of them were fond of being outshone by their sister. Resentment simmered. Whispers of jealousy and scandal began to circulate, some even suggesting that her closeness to her father was unnatural. Others accused her of seeking too much power for a woman. Yet Kaidu stood by her. During his many campaigns against the Yuan dynasty and their allies, Khutulun remained one of his most reliable commanders. She led her own units, charged into battle, and brought home victories. Soldiers followed her not because of her name, but because of her record. She wasn't a token warrior, she was the real thing. And with every campaign, her legend grew, not just as a woman among men, but as a warrior among warriors. As Khutulun's fame on the battlefield surged, so did the whispers. To her father, Kaidu Khan, Khutulun was more than just a daughter. She was his right hand, his most trusted general, and, according to some sources, his preferred successor. While her brothers bickered and schemed, Khutulun remained unwavering in her loyalty. She was bold, strategic, and brutally effective. In a world where trust could mean life or death, Kaidu had no doubts about her. But the rest of the Mongol aristocracy wasn't as confident. The idea of a woman inheriting power, let alone ruling an entire Khanate, was enough to send shockwaves through the traditionalist ranks. Sure, Mongol women had historically enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in other parts of the medieval world. They could own property, advise on politics, even ride into war. But to rule outright? That was a different story. As Kaidu's health began to decline, the issue of succession became urgent. Khutulun remained his obvious choice in terms of loyalty and merit. But politics doesn't always reward merit. Her brothers, cousins, and various Mongol nobles saw an opportunity to block her rise, and they began to act. Some spread rumors that her relationship with Kaidu was inappropriate, crossing lines of familial closeness. Others accused her of using sorcery or feminine manipulation to win influence. These weren't just idle gossip, they were calculated attacks meant to discredit her in the eyes of the tribal councils. But Khutulun didn't back down. She continued to appear at Kaidu's side during military councils. She commanded troops with the same unshakable confidence. Her power was visible, undeniable. And yet, it wasn't enough. Even her father began to sense the political storm brewing. Despite his unwavering support, he could see that naming her as heir might divide the Khanate, or worse, spark a civil war after his death. Mongol rule depended on strength and unity. A disputed succession could unravel everything he had built. In the end, Kaidu never officially named Khutulun his successor, not because she was unworthy, but because her worth made her dangerous to those clinging to an old world. She had fought harder, led better, and remained more loyal than any man around her. And still, the throne stayed just out of reach. For now. For years, Khutulun had stood firm. She would only marry the man who could defeat her in wrestling. None had succeeded, and with every broken suitor sent home horseless, her legend grew, along with the pressure to abandon her vow. Kaidu's tolerance had limits. While he respected her independence and military skill, he was still a father, and more importantly, a Khan with political obligations. The Mongol world was built on strategic marriages, and Kaidu needed alliances to strengthen his hold against Kublai Khan and rival tribes. Having an unmarried daughter, even one as formidable as Khutulun, left a glaring opportunity untapped. Eventually, the tension became too great to ignore. Kaidu, under pressure from his advisors and other noble houses, reportedly urged Khutulun to reconsider her terms. The political climate was shifting. Her victories on the battlefield, while impressive, were no longer enough to shield her from internal expectations. And so, reluctantly, Khutulun married. The identity of her husband remains shrouded in mystery. Some sources say he was a man accused of plotting against Kaidu, and the marriage was her way of demonstrating loyalty to her father, choosing to wed the accused man herself to prove his innocence. Others claim the man was selected for political reasons, someone deemed worthy by the tribal council, even if he hadn't bested her in sport. What is certain, however, is that Khutulun did not marry for love, and she did not marry on her own terms. Her wrestling challenge disappeared. Her resistance, at least publicly, had ended. But if her opponents expected her to fade quietly into domestic life, they were sorely mistaken. Even after marriage, Khutulun continued to command troops. She still rode into battle. She maintained her position at her father's side until his final days. The title of wife changed little about her role in the political and military affairs of the Chagatai Khanate. Still, her marriage marked the beginning of a shift. The legend of the unconquered warrior princess had met the realities of dynastic politics. Even Khutulun, fierce as she was, could not completely escape the demands of the world she was born into. Yet she had made her point, on the battlefield, on the wrestling ground, and in the hearts of her people. She had never been defeated. Not really. In 1301, everything changed. Kaidu Khan, the powerful warlord who had defied Kublai Khan, kept the western steppe in check and trusted his daughter more than any of his sons, died. His passing sent a tremor through the Chagatai Khanate. Without a clear successor, the line of inheritance fractured immediately. Kaidu had never officially named Khutulun as his heir, despite her unmatched military record and steadfast loyalty. Whether he feared political backlash or believed the nobles would never accept a woman, he left the throne open, and the wolves descended. Her brothers, particularly Orus and Chapar, scrambled to fill the vacuum. Some claimed Kaidu had whispered a name on his deathbed. Others insisted they had always been the rightful heirs. What followed wasn't just a succession debate. It was a power struggle laced with betrayal, rivalry, and violence. Khutulun didn't stand idle. Though she may not have been formally recognized as the Khan's successor, she wielded more influence than most of her male relatives combined. Her support, or opposition, could make or break a claim. Soldiers still followed her. Local leaders still respected her. Many believed she should rule, and there are reports, fragmentary and debated, that Khutulun attempted to claim leadership in the immediate aftermath of Kaidu's death. If true, this would have made her one of the few women in Mongol history to vie openly for power at the Khanal level. But the odds were against her. The steppes' traditions were not ready to accept a female Khan, no matter how capable she was. The same commanders who had once praised her in battle now turned to her brothers, fearing the political instability that might come from breaking patriarchal norms. Khutulun's opposition grew louder. Her options grew fewer. In the end, Chapar seized power, backed by influential nobles and opportunists. Khutulun was sidelined, but not entirely erased. She continued to hold command in her own territory and remained a feared presence. Still, the reins of the Khanate slipped through her fingers. It was a bitter turn. The woman who had fought beside her father for decades was denied the chance to lead in his place. But Khutulun didn't disappear. She watched. She advised. And she waited. For even in defeat, she was never diminished. As the dust settled from Kaidu's death and the succession battles cooled, Khutulun found herself in a strange position. Still powerful, still feared, but increasingly isolated. Her brother Chapar now held formal control of the Khanate, though his rule was tenuous at best. He lacked Kaidu's charisma, Khutulun's military brilliance, and the loyalty of many tribal leaders. The political landscape had become unstable. Alliances shifted quickly. The Mongol Empire, once united by Genghis Khan's iron will, had splintered into competing factions, each led by Khans more concerned with self-preservation than unity. Khutulun remained at the edge of this chaos. She still commanded warriors loyal to her. She still advised in military matters. But the open road to leadership had closed. Her position was now more symbolic, an icon of what could have been. And then, just as quietly as she had emerged decades earlier, Khutulun vanished from the record. She died in 1306, her exact cause of death unknown. No chronicles detail her final battle, or whether she died in war or peace. There were no grand funerals recorded, no epics composed at the time. Just a sudden silence. Some speculate she was assassinated by political enemies. Others believe she died of illness. A few wonder if she chose exile, retreating into obscurity once it became clear that her time had passed. But the lack of details does not erase the weight of her legacy. Khutulun had lived her life by her own code, fierce, loyal, and unbending. She had out-wrestled every man who tried to conquer her. She had ridden into battle not as decoration, but as a general. She had earned her father's trust and nearly ruled in his place. In a world dominated by men, she stood as an equal, and often their superior. No husband had ever defeated her. No enemy had ever conquered her. And even in death she remained unconquered in memory. While her brothers' names faded into the footnotes of Mongol history, Khutulun became legend. Her name would live on in the tales told around fires, in the whispers of travelling merchants, and, eventually, in the pages of history books written centuries later. She may have died quietly, but nothing about her life had ever been quiet. Khutulun's physical presence may have disappeared in 1306, but her legend refused to die. For centuries, her story travelled not through formal chronicles, but by word of mouth, carried by nomads across the steppes, by traders on the Silk Road, and by foreign visitors both fascinated and confused by the memory of a woman who had wrestled her way into history. One of the earliest outsiders to mention her was Marco Polo, the Venetian traveller who visited the Mongol court in the late 13th century. He spoke of a warrior princess who could ride into enemy ranks and seize a man as easily as a hawk snatches a chicken. Though his accounts are often coloured with exaggeration, Polo's portrayal helped enshrine Khutulun in the Western imagination, not just as a curiosity, but as a marvel. Later chroniclers like Rashid al-Din included her in their histories, focusing more on her martial abilities and her unusual vow of wrestling for marriage. While these accounts differ in detail, they all agree on the essentials. Khutulun was a woman of extraordinary strength, intelligence, and autonomy, in a world that rarely allowed such traits to flourish in women. And then came the transformation, from legend to symbol. Centuries after her death, Khutulun's story was reimagined in various forms. In the 18th century, her life inspired a French opera titled Turandot, though with a heavy European twist. In this version, Khutulun becomes the icy Chinese princess who refuses to marry any man unless he can solve her riddles. Those who fail are executed. The bloodthirsty tone has little to do with the historical Khutulun, but it shows how powerful her legend had become. So powerful that it could be reshaped, absorbed, and misrepresented across cultures. The most famous adaptation, of course, came in the 20th century with Puccini's opera Turandot. Audiences around the world heard Khutulun's story without ever hearing her name. The woman behind the myth was lost in translation, but not erased. Today, historians and feminist scholars have worked to reclaim her truth from the fog of fiction. In Mongolia and Central Asia, Khutulun is celebrated as a national hero, a symbol of female strength and resistance. Statues have been raised in her honor. Her name lives on in popular retellings, both academic and poetic. Because long after empires fall, stories endure, and hers still thunders like hooves across the steppe. In a world still grappling with the limits placed on women, on who they're allowed to be, what they're permitted to achieve, Khutulun's story resonates more than ever. She wasn't a queen tucked away in a palace, nor a passive figurehead married off for diplomacy. She was a general, a wrestler, a tactician, and a daughter who might have become a ruler. Her life remains a fierce rebuttal to the idea that women in history were always silent, always obedient, always sidelined. Khutulun wasn't. Across Central Asia today, Khutulun's name is spoken with pride. In Mongolia, she is hailed as a symbol of female power, a true descendant of Genghis Khan, who proved that strength and femininity were never mutually exclusive. In wrestling circles, her name is evoked with reverence. Some even consider her the spiritual mother of Burk, Mongolian wrestling itself. Women who take up arms or challenge tradition are often compared to her. She has become a cultural shorthand for fearless defiance. Modern scholars and authors have also begun restoring her story to its rightful place. While earlier generations remembered her through warped Western lenses, romanticized, exoticized, or misrepresented, contemporary historians are sifting through the layers, reclaiming the true Khutulun, not a fairy tale princess, but a real human being who demanded to live on her terms. She's inspired children's books, documentaries, and academic theses. Her legacy has also seeped into pop culture, appearing in shows like Marco Polo, where she's portrayed as a fierce warrior, unafraid to speak her mind or challenge tradition. Though dramatized, these portrayals at least reintroduce her to modern audiences, inviting them to dig deeper. Her story is also part of a broader effort to rewrite the historical narrative, to make space for the voices long ignored or misrepresented. Khutulun isn't just a historical footnote. She's a chapter that was almost erased, now rediscovered. And perhaps that's her greatest victory. She lived in an era where power was measured in strength, loyalty, and legacy, and she mastered all three. No man ever conquered her in sport, no army ever crushed her in war, and no culture, no empire, no time period could silence her completely. Khutulun lives on, as legend, as symbol, and as proof that sometimes the fiercest warrior wears a braid, not a crown. Imagine a world without hospitals, surgical theatres, or even a fixed address. Now imagine thriving in it. For the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, from the Scythians and Sarmatians to the Turks and Mongols, this wasn't a temporary state. It was a way of life. Always on the move, chasing grazing pastures and evading enemies, they had no luxury for stationary institutions. And yet, they developed a remarkably effective system of medicine, fluid, adaptive, and as mobile as the people it served. Nomadic medicine wasn't centered around buildings or bureaucracy. It was carried on horseback, stored in saddlebags, and passed down through spoken word, observation, and spiritual ritual. There were no clinics, no white coats. The healer came to you, or sometimes rode beside you into battle. This was medicine born out of necessity and honed by generations of intimate observation of the land, animals, and people. Nomads treated wounds in the field, under the open sky. They cured infections in felt tents. They delivered babies miles from the nearest settlement. Their methods may seem simple to modern eyes, but they were anything but primitive. Theirs was a holistic approach. Healing was not just about treating a physical symptom, it was about restoring balance between body, soul, and spirit. Illness was often seen as the result of disharmony with the natural world, with one's ancestors, or with unseen spirits. And so, medicine among the steppe peoples was never just a science, it was also deeply spiritual. Knowledge came not from books, but from lived experience. The role of healer often fell to shamans, elders, or those with an inherited calling. They memorized plant lore, knew how to reduce fevers with goat's milk or willow bark, and could set a broken bone using leather straps and smooth river stones. But they also spoke to spirits, performed purification rituals, and interpreted dreams. Nomadic medicine was shaped by resilience. You couldn't wait for a specialist. You had to know how to act, quickly and wisely. Every rider, every mother, every elder was expected to know something about health, because survival depended on it. In a world that moved with the wind and lived on horseback, medicine had to keep up. And somehow it did. In the world of nomadic medicine, the most powerful healer wasn't a doctor in a white coat, it was the shaman. Shamans held a unique place in steppe societies. They were part healer, part priest, part psychologist, and part performer. Often chosen through visions, dreams, or signs of spiritual sensitivity, shamans were believed to walk between worlds, the physical and the spiritual, the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. To a nomadic community, illness wasn't just a biological problem. It could be the result of offending a spirit, angering an ancestor, or being struck by the malevolent gaze of an evil eye. Physical symptoms were interpreted through a spiritual lens. That's where the shaman came in. When someone fell ill, especially with no clear injury or explanation, the shaman was summoned. Dressed in elaborate robes made of fur, feathers, bones, and bells, they would enter a trance, sometimes with the help of rhythmic drumming, chanting, or inhaling smoke from sacred herbs. In this altered state, the shaman would attempt to communicate with spirits to find the source of the illness. Healing rituals might involve drawing illness out of the body with the help of talismans or feathers, chanting protective spells, or using sacred objects like mirrors to reflect spiritual harm. Some rituals required sacrifices of animals, milk, or incense to appease the spirit world. But shamans weren't only spiritual mediators, they were also practical healers. Many had a deep understanding of medicinal herbs, midwifery, and emergency care. They could dress wounds, reduce fevers, and treat common ailments. What made them unique was that they saw the body and soul as one, never separated. Interestingly, shamans often served multiple communities across the steppe. Their fame spread not through social media, but through oral tradition. A powerful healer might be summoned from hundreds of miles away to perform a cure. Gender roles varied. In some cultures, shamans were predominantly male. In others, especially among Turkic and Siberian nomads, female shamans were equally respected. Some were even gender fluid, seen as spiritually powerful because they existed outside conventional roles. In times of illness, it was the shaman's tent that offered both comfort and confrontation. A place where healing meant facing not only your pain, but the spirits behind it. To the nomads, health was not just about survival. It was about balance with the world you rode through, and the worlds you couldn't see. With no apothecaries or stocked pharmacies, nomadic healers relied on what the land offered, and the steppe offered more than you'd think. The vast grasslands of Central Asia, Siberia, and the Caucasus weren't just grazing territory for horses and sheep. They were medicine cabinets, plants, minerals, animal parts. Every natural element was fair game for healing. Knowledge of these remedies was passed down orally, generation to generation, often guarded by elders, midwives, and shamans. Take the yarrow plant, for example. Common across Eurasia, it was crushed into a poultice to stop bleeding. Willow bark, which contains salicin, the compound from which aspirin is derived, was brewed into tea to treat fevers and inflammation. Juniper berries were burned in ritual purification, but also brewed as a tonic for digestive issues and used to disinfect wounds. Garlic, wild onions, and fermented mare's milk, airag, were frequently used as immunity boosters. Herbal treatments weren't just about ingredients, they were about timing. Plants were gathered at specific times of year, under specific moon phases, or after particular rituals. Some herbs were dried and stored in leather pouches. Others had to be used fresh. The preparation was just as important as the plant itself. Animal-based medicine also had its place. Yak or sheep fat was used to treat frostbite. Bear bile and deer antler shavings were believed to boost vitality. Horse milk, rich in vitamin C, was not only a daily drink, but also a common remedy for weakness, fatigue, and even depression. And then there were stones and minerals. Powdered limestone was sometimes applied to wounds to dry them out. Sulfur was burned to cleanse sick tents. Salt was essential, not only for preservation, but for purging and disinfecting. What's striking about nomadic pharmacology is its holistic nature. Remedies were rarely administered alone. A tea came with a prayer. A wound was treated while a charm was tied around the wrist. Physical and spiritual healing went hand in hand. Healers knew their environments intimately. They could look at a patch of wildflowers and tell you which were safe to eat, which could calm a cough, and which would kill a man by morning. That knowledge wasn't written down, it was lived. And if you wanted to survive the open steppe, you didn't just need a sword. You needed someone who could tell roots from poison. Nomadic life wasn't just about tending livestock or herding across open plains. It was a life of war, raids, and physical hardship. And when bones cracked or blood flowed, healing had to be swift, smart, and mobile. Battlefield medicine was a vital skill among nomads, especially for warrior cultures like the Scythians, Huns, Turks, and Mongols. In these societies, everyone knew how to ride and fight, and that meant injuries were common. From broken ribs to deep lacerations, nomadic healers had to act fast, often with nothing more than a saddlebag of tools and a sharp mind. Bone setting was one of the most valued healing arts. Dislocations, fractures, and joint injuries were treated using surprisingly advanced techniques. Healers used animal sinew or strips of rawhide as makeshift splints. Smooth stones or carved bone braces kept limbs immobile. Dislocated joints were popped back into place with controlled leverage, a skill that was part art, part brute force. Wounds were cleaned using boiled water, alcohol from fermented milk, or infused herbal tonics. Cauterization was commonly practiced, heating a metal tool in fire and pressing it to a wound to stop bleeding and prevent infection. Painful? Yes, but effective. It meant the difference between life and death in an age before antibiotics. Suturing techniques also existed. Horsehair or sheep gut could be used as thread, and bone needles were common. Wounds were stitched, then sealed with natural resins or animal fat to protect them from dirt and bacteria. In serious cases, bloodletting was employed, not always out of superstition, but as a method to relieve swelling, bruising, or perceived imbalances in the body. Horns, blades, and even leeches were used, depending on the tribe and the condition. Interestingly, battlefield surgery didn't only happen after a fight, it often took place during it. Some shamans or senior warriors carried small kits to dress wounds mid-battle. Quick thinking and crude field dressings kept soldiers fighting longer and helped prevent infection from setting in early. Even dentistry wasn't ignored. Cracked or rotting teeth were pulled using iron tools. For toothaches, they applied a paste made of clove oil, ground bone, and wild herbs directly to the gum. Nomads couldn't afford long recovery times. Their medicine had to be portable, fast, and effective. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And when you live in a world where danger gallops just over the next hill, that's all that mattered. Among nomadic peoples, the birth of a child was both a blessing and a battlefield. Without permanent shelters, maternity wards, or trained obstetricians, childbirth on the steppe was a dangerous yet sacred event, handled almost entirely by women, using a mix of experience, herbal knowledge, spiritual ritual, and sheer resilience. Midwives were central to this world. They weren't formally trained, but they carried generations of knowledge passed down through observation and oral tradition. These women knew how to position a baby, how to soothe a mother in labour, and how to act fast when things went wrong. Births typically happened inside gers or yurts, the felt-covered tents of the steppe, which could be made warm, clean, and private. The mother would squat, stand, or lean against another woman during delivery, positions that used gravity to assist the birth and minimized prolonged labour. The midwife monitored the baby's position, adjusted the mother's breathing, and massaged her abdomen to encourage contractions. Pain management came through both herbal remedies and ritual. A tea made of valerian root or wild poppy might be used to calm the mother's nerves. Juniper smoke was often burned to cleanse the space and drive away malevolent spirits. The presence of charms, amulets, and whispered blessings helped create a sense of protection. If complications arose, breech birth, hemorrhaging, retained placenta, the midwife had limited options, but a lifetime of practiced intuition. Herbs like shepherd's purse or yarrow were used to control bleeding. Pressure techniques and warm compresses were applied to help reposition the fetus. In rare cases, forced delivery by hand might be attempted, a dangerous move, but sometimes the only choice. Once the baby was born, horse milk or warm sheep's milk was often the first nourishment, especially if the mother was weak. The umbilical cord was cut with a sterilized knife or flint, then tied with a string soaked in alcohol or brine. The baby was swaddled in felt and anointed with protective symbols, sometimes soot or oils placed on the forehead or chest. Infant mortality was high. But when both mother and child survived, it was cause for major celebration. The newborn was not just a child, it was the future of the clan, another rider for the endless steppe. And for nomads, that meant everything. Not all illnesses came from wounds or weather. Sometimes, the body broke without explanation. A man would grow weak despite eating well. A child would stop speaking. A warrior would suffer nightmares and refuse to ride. These were not just illnesses, they were signs of a spirit sickness. For the nomads of the steppe, the invisible was just as real as the visible. They believed that spiritual imbalance, curses, or offended ancestors could manifest as disease. This wasn't superstition. It was an integrated part of their worldview, where health depended on harmony between the physical and the spiritual. When someone fell mysteriously ill, they didn't always call the midwife or the bone setter. They called the shaman. The shaman would examine the symptoms, not just physical ones, but emotional and behavioral changes. Was the patient talking to unseen things? Had they become withdrawn? Were they unusually angry or afraid? These were signs that the illness came from another world. Diagnosis involved ritual. The shaman might burn herbs like mugwort or juniper, chant to the ancestors, or use objects like bones, mirrors, or drums to read the spirit world. The illness could be caused by a wandering soul, an angry ancestor, or a demonic force. Sometimes it was said that the person's soul had left the body and become lost. To heal, the shaman performed soul retrieval rituals. These were dramatic events. The shaman might don elaborate costumes, mimic the behavior of animals, or speak in strange voices. All of this was intended to draw the spirit's attention, negotiate its return, or chase away harmful forces. Talismans were placed under pillows. Protective tattoos were drawn. Salt circles were laid around the yurt. Some shamans used animal sacrifices, offering the blood of a lamb or goat to appease the spirit realm. For more common spiritual afflictions like nightmares, infertility, or melancholy, smaller rituals were held. Dreamcatcher-like charms made of bones, feathers, and thread were hung over sleeping areas. Special songs were sung. Milk or vodka was poured as an offering to the spirits. What modern medicine might call trauma, depression, or psychosis, nomadic societies treated through story, ritual, and deep communal care. The illness was not just yours. It affected the tribe. And healing meant bringing the whole world back into balance. In the absence of medical schools or written manuals, how did nomadic societies preserve and pass down medical knowledge? The answer: collective memory. Nomadic medicine was not centralized in universities or locked away in elite circles. It lived in the mouths of elders, in the hands of mothers, and in the practices of every rider, hunter, and healer. It was communal, taught through demonstration, remembered through story, and refined through lived experience on the open steppe. Children grew up watching injuries treated after horse falls, or fevers soothed with herbal steam. By the time they reached adulthood, they knew the basics: how to stop bleeding with moss, how to prepare a root tea for stomach cramps, how to recognize the signs of a spiritual affliction. Knowledge wasn't given through formal lessons, it was embedded in daily life. Elders played a crucial role. Grandmothers especially were often walking encyclopedias of medicinal knowledge. They knew which plants to gather in spring, how to prepare a poultice for swollen joints, or how to ease childbirth pains with rhythmic chanting and breath control. Many acted as informal doctors within the clan, treating ailments while telling stories that carried layers of coded advice and health wisdom. Shamans trained apprentices, not through classrooms, but through mentorship. A chosen pupil might spend years learning how to interpret dreams, prepare ritual tools, or enter trance states safely. The training was personal, intuitive, and deeply spiritual. There were no exams, but failure could mean disaster for both patient and healer. The communal nature of knowledge also meant that nomadic medicine could adapt. If a new herb was discovered while migrating to unfamiliar lands, its effects were tested, documented orally, and shared. A new treatment might be tried on a sick animal before a human. If it worked, it became part of the tribe's living knowledge. This oral tradition had its vulnerabilities. Disease outbreaks could wipe out entire family lines and their medicinal wisdom with them. But it also had its strengths. It was flexible, dynamic, and resilient. It could travel with the tribe, change with the seasons, and adapt to new threats. In a world where everything moved, the one constant was memory, not written in books, but in the rhythm of everyday life. A knowledge passed not by pen, but by firelight, sweat, and story. For nomadic societies, animals weren't just companions or commodities, they were lifelines. Horses, sheep, yaks, goats, and camels formed the backbone of steppe economies, culture, and even spiritual life. So naturally, caring for animal health was just as critical as healing human wounds, sometimes more so. Animal medicine was a highly developed parallel system, often overseen by the same people who treated human ailments. In fact, the line between veterinary and human medicine was blurred. If something could heal a sick goat, it might work for a person, and vice versa. The bond between rider and horse especially shaped a deep understanding of physiology, trauma, and recovery. Common illnesses like hoof rot, skin infections, respiratory issues, or parasites were treated with herbal mixtures, poultices, and smoke. Burned juniper and wormwood smoke wasn't just used for humans, it was also waved over stables to disinfect the air and repel pests. Fleas and ticks were driven off with crushed garlic rubbed into the animal's fur or skin. For deeper infections or open wounds, healers might use heated metal to cauterize, just like with humans. Horse fat or sheep tallow was applied to wounds to prevent cracking and promote healing, especially in winter. Broken bones in animals were rare but not impossible, and were treated with wooden braces and tightly wrapped leather bindings, followed by enforced rest. The animal might be hobbled or kept close to camp while it healed. Colic in horses, a potentially fatal condition, was treated with massaging, herbal tonics, and in some cases, forced walking to restart the digestive system. For milk animals, mastitis, a breast infection, was known and treated with warm compresses and constant milking to relieve pressure. What's remarkable is that these treatments were learned without books, lab testing, or diagnostics. They came from generational observation and close living with animals. A nomadic herder could look at a camel's gait and know something was wrong. A grandmother could hear the tone of a sheep's bleat and recognize fever. The spiritual dimension was never far off either. Animals were believed to be affected by spirits just like people. A shaman might bless a sick horse or perform a cleansing ritual for a herd stricken with illness. Because if the animals died, the people didn't just lose wealth. They lost movement, milk, meat, and mobility. Healing the herd meant healing the heart of nomadic life. Though modern hospitals, pharmaceuticals, and globalized healthcare have changed the way we view medicine, the legacy of nomadic healing still lingers, quietly resilient, often overlooked, but remarkably enduring. Many of the remedies once carried in leather pouches and whispered in wind-swept tents have found validation in modern science. Willow bark is now recognized as the natural precursor to aspirin. Juniper smoke is understood to have antimicrobial properties. Techniques like bone setting, herbal poultices, and warm compresses continue to be used around the world, some unchanged for centuries. But more than the remedies themselves, it's the philosophy behind nomadic medicine that still speaks to us today. Steppe healing was built on adaptability. It didn't rely on sterile labs or climate-controlled pharmacies. It relied on being observant, inventive, and grounded in nature. It wasn't about cure so much as balance, restoring harmony between the body, the community, the spirit world, and the land. This mindset is returning. In a world increasingly overwhelmed by synthetic quick fixes and impersonal healthcare systems, there's a growing hunger for holistic medicine, for plant-based treatments, and for respectful integration of traditional knowledge. What was once dismissed as superstition is now being re-evaluated as a body of experiential wisdom, tested, adapted, and preserved through the sheer necessity of survival. In Mongolia and across Central Asia, nomadic medicine is still practiced. Healers still prepare teas from wild herbs, still perform shamanic rituals, still teach children the signs of a sick animal or the first symptom of frostbite. Even among modernized populations, remnants of this tradition persist, woven into cultural identity like thread through felt. Of course, not all steppe medicine was safe or effective. Some rituals were based on belief rather than biology. But the human insight, the awareness of emotional health, the power of communal care, the role of nature in healing, remains timeless. Nomadic medicine teaches us that healing doesn't have to be high-tech to be profound. It shows that care can exist in a tent, on a mountain, in the middle of nowhere, that a healer doesn't need a degree to be wise, that health is as much about connection, to people, to place, to purpose, as it is about biology. And in that lesson, the steppe still speaks.